All right, we're back at AthletiCamps, and we're here for a final in a series of lectures that Bruce Hendler is hosting here. And let's find out what's on tap for tonight. So what's the final lecture on tonight?
Final lecture is back to nutrition, and we're going to talk about on the bike or exercise nutrition, pre-competition, pre-training strategies on the bike, while you're exercising, while you're doing your things, and recovery also, probably one of the most important areas of sport nutrition, especially as we enter the race season. So it should be a good discussion, so enjoy it.
All right, great.
Huge crowd, which is fantastic. So I just had a couple of announcements to make. First of all, this is the last of this series. Obviously, with the turnout and the enthusiasm for the series, I'm planning another one sometime, probably in the summer, probably different topics. I don't know what they're going to be yet. If anyone has any suggestions of things they would like to see as it relates to the sport, feel free to email me. Fantastic. But I wanted to thank you. This has just been actually more than I ever thought it would be when I sent out the first invitation. So it's been fantastic. Obviously, Marlia has been great, and all my guests that have come in and helped me out. So it's been fantastic. Just a couple of quick things. Remember, the Italy trip is on September 3rd through 10th. So if anyone's interested, I have a sign-up sheet. The other thing I'm doing, and it's also back on the sign-up sheet, May 1st and May 23rd, 2 separate dates, going to hold a time trial workshop, something that's going to be really special. So the whole idea there will be, we're going to do it over in Davis because it's flat. We're going to have video and camera and film and fittings and talk about training. So it'll be the type of thing where you come, you get videoed, we'll make adjustments to the bike. We're going to actually calculate drag effect, things like that. And then you'll go ride for a few weeks on the setup, and you'll come back on the 23rd for part 2, which will be more adjustments, obviously. So that will be on the website, and if anyone is interested in any of that, please don't hesitate to let me know. And just to get, I'm going to have my scooter for that too. So it's a lot of fun. Don't forget motor pacing too, if anyone wants motor pacing. And as always, the Gerstein stuff's on sale. T-shirts are only $10 tonight, so get them while you can. And I'll hand it over to Marlia again for number 3.
Number 3, last one. Very good. Thanks again for everyone for coming. Today we're going to, we've talked about weight loss, we've talked about supplements, we've talked about a few supplements that sort of pertain today. Branched chain amino acids, in particular caffeine. I'm going to briefly touch on them, but not go into as depth as we did last time. But mostly today we're going to talk about nutrition surrounding your training, during your training, and after your training to optimize your training. So feel free to ask questions as we go, as there's a lot on this topic. So we're going to talk about the training diet 1 week before, the day before, fueling before your exercise, during exercise, and recovery being a very important component. Let's spend a little bit of time on the training diet, though. Obviously, the first section we were here, we talked about counting calorie requirements. We used the Harris-Benedict equations commonly used. The Cunningham equation, which uses body fat composition, is another one that's very helpful for athletes. And then there's another equation, the Mifflin equation, that's commonly just used in, not necessarily in athletes, more in obese patients. So separate from these equations, we also have some just general numbers of calorie requirements based on body weight, based on number of hours of exercise. This is less specific. The equations included your age, height, weight, gender, a resting requirement. And we talked about your hours sitting at a desk, sleeping, on a bike, running, whatever we're doing. All of those include an activity factor to get an average activity factor to give you a more accurate assessment of your calorie requirements. I do that as part of my diet assessment, is get a picture of a typical day for you, where are your calories being expended, for how long, to get a better idea of the calories. But this is just a rough equation. As you can see, your calorie requirements definitely go up as your time being physically active. I think we also have to step back and think to ourselves, how physically active are we? Yeah, I get in the pool in the morning and swim 3,000 yards, but I'm on my butt all day sitting in front of a computer seeing patients. So realistically, I get that 1 hour, but realistically, I'm spending 8-9 hours sitting. So we also have to think about how many calories we're actually expending, how busy are we. When it comes to your calorie distribution, there's 3 sources of calories in the diet. There's carbohydrate, protein, and fat. As endurance athletes riding bikes, your requirement for carbohydrates is much greater. We're going to talk about that. The percentages can vary from anywhere to 55 to 65% carbohydrate. Fat percentages, basically anything under 30%, 20 to 25%, and then the protein percentage can vary. These percentages can vary based on where you are in your training cycle, called the periodization of training. The more training, the more hours you're spending training, obviously the greater your calorie needs to sustain that, but a greater percentage of your calories will be coming from carbohydrate to sustain that. Off season, you're not burning as many calories, you need less calories. You don't need all the carbohydrate in the off season, and you might even be doing a little bit more protein in the diet to maintain muscle tissue and lose 5 or 10 pounds in the off season. So these percentages flux. And as you'll see, as we get into our training, and maybe even have a peak event we're training for, we're actually going to have a bigger distribution of our calories from carbohydrate. Off season though, all of that changes. So we have to keep in mind that fluctuates during your season. And the reason being for carbohydrate being a large percentage in the diet, we store carbohydrate in the body, in your muscles and in your liver, called glycogen. Sorry, there's a little bit of delay on this. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate. Each one of these little balls is glucose. Your liver has a very large storage of carbohydrate, glycogen, and all your muscles have their own little stores of carbohydrate. Now, the downside to this is it's finite storage, about 1,800 calories total. The liver's predominant goal is to maintain blood sugars.
Is that true for everybody, or does it depend on size?
It does depend on size. It also depends on your training diet. The more carbohydrate you consume, in reflection to your training, you can store a little bit more. The smaller you are, the less muscle mass you have, the less glycogen stores you're going to have.
But then you need less if you weigh less too, don't you?
That's right. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay. One does not fit all. But unlike fat, we can store plenty of fat tissue. We store water with carbohydrate. For every 3 ounces of carbohydrate, we're storing about 1 ounce of water. So part of the glycogen or carbo loading is also that weight change is water as a reflection of that. But if we were to try and compare our fat stores to our glycogen stores, calorie for calorie, we'd be the size of dump trucks in reflection of that because of the water stored with the carbohydrates. So we're this finite amount. And I call this in the body like the gas tank in a car. You got a 20-gallon tank, you put 25 in, you got 5 on the ground. You put 12 in, you're not going to get very far as you would on a 20-gallon tank. So your glycogen stores are important. Now remember, part of energy metabolism requires oxygen to break down and produce a lot of energy. But in situations where you have less oxygen, you're climbing a hill, you're sprinting, doing interval training, the less oxygen you have, the more glycogen you use. We can use glucose as a source of energy without oxygen. But we have plenty of oxygen. We walk, or we're going on a spin ride. We're using glucose and fat as a source of energy, but we'll use far more fat because we have plenty of oxygen to burn that. But again, back to the glycogen stores, you think about your gas tank. You're driving along and you speed up to pass somebody. You're one of those cars where you can see your gas mileage drop. That's you're using your gas to get around that person, and you slow up and you go speed limit, you are going to extend your gas tank longer. Same idea happens here. You dip into your glycogen stores, not enough oxygen, we dip into them significantly. Then you might back off with an interval, take some time off. You can use your fat stores there too to help because you have plenty of oxygen. Then you dip into them again when you get back onto the next interval. So carbohydrate's important, it's a great source of energy, but it's limited. We only can store so much, so it only lasts a certain period of time. So we have glycogen depletion during 90 minutes of intense cycling. Of course, cyclists are great to do research on. Stick them on a bike, do manipulation to their diet, some muscle biopsies, and we can see changes in their glycogen stores, their blood sugars as well. So assuming the gas tank is full at the onset of physical activity, at a high intensity, 65-70% of your VO2 max, you're going to use your glycogen stores and be out by right around 90 minutes. It's this idea, this practice, this is what we see in research, is where a lot of the recommendations on the bike come from. You're going to run out of glycogen stores. You need carbohydrate during exercise. You have fat, but you also need carbohydrate. Your brain's living off of sugar, so there's one big factor we have to take into consideration. But then you start doing some training without a lot of oxygen, you're going to require your glycogen. If you don't have enough because you've run out of it, you're now going to rely on what you ate as a source of energy. So another reason why diets are high in carbohydrate for endurance athletes, because we see greater muscle glycogen stores, improved time of work with a higher carbohydrate diet. So practicing a low carbohydrate diet might be 35%, less than 40% of your calories from carbohydrate. You have less muscle glycogen, and you're going to be able to not work as long. You're going to exhaust sooner. But it does start to level off a bit. This isn't going to be linear. 8,000 calories of carbohydrate means you can work, 8 hours straight. That's not the case. You do start to max out because we have a finite amount of how much we can store. Yeah.
So the glycogen reserve will only be replaced by the carbohydrates, so the fat sitting on my body is never going to turn into that and go fill the tank up?
It's a really good question. So during exercise, the carbohydrate you're consuming is to help maintain blood sugars and use as a source of energy. We're not refilling glycogen stores during exercise. The body is not in an anabolic mode to do that. Now, if we could find a pill to convert fat to sugar, we would solve all of America's problems. The problem is you cannot convert fat to glucose, but you can convert muscle tissue to glucose, a source of energy. Yeah.
Interestingly, I saw a show, I don't know what it was, Discovery, in the middle of the night, you wake up, turn it on. This guy swam the channel, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about. He had 30 pounds of fat extra on. I mean, he worked, that was his whole plan. That was how he was going to get across the channel. And he did, he burned fat.
Buoyancy is a big factor there. If you look at that, body fat composition, in long endurance, cold water swimmers, they have a high body fat just as they have.
Right, but he lost weight. I mean,
Yes, of course he's going to lose
he
weight.
used that
Yes,
fat
he
for
will.
energy.
Yes,
Is that
because he's
true?
shivering, he's staying warm, source of calories. You're using fat all the time. You're using fat now and sugar now. If we all took a nice walk outside, we're using fat and sugar. If we start doing sprints, we're going to use more sugar, less fat. So it's this constant balance. Swim in the channel, you have to have a sustained, kind of find your groove, and you're not killing yourself at a high pace because you have to be able to do a long period of time. You have plenty of oxygen to burn that fat.
So that's why. It
Yeah.
would never work.
He still ate, I'm sure.
Oh.
Guaranteed. But there's no conversion of the fat to sugar. So at some point, we have to consume carbohydrate to maintain blood sugars. One, because the brain has to think. That's part of our feelings of exertion. If our brain's not getting enough sugar, we feel pretty crummy. We're going to have to slow down or slow the RPMs, and we may even now hate the sport when we're feeling like that. So we have to consume carbohydrate because of that. It's a limiting factor. So you're driving along, it's like someone's giving you a little bit of gas in your engine to keep you going. We're not filling the tank, we're just putting a little bit of gas in the engine to keep it going. Whereas we have plenty of fat for all of that, but we're not always reliant on that 100%.
So speaking of pills, right, to
Uh-huh.
Can I do that? What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know enough about it to know what's really happening there. I don't know if you have a comment, Dr. Novasio, on that.
Later.
What's that?
Later, unfortunately, when I start, it's difficult for me to stop.
Stop. Okay. Thanks for knowing your limit. So, we can bring that up afterwards. But yeah, we can find a way to convert. Now, the idea behind the carbohydrate is to help with your glycogen stores. But as we talked about in the supplement lecture, protein is also helpful in long endurance and endurance athletes in general because we can use those amino acids from protein as a source of energy in addition to the glucose. And we also see less muscle breakdown in relationship to that physical activity when we do supplement with protein during training. Yeah.
What is the time that that's effective at
In the sense of going on in
during
the,
an event?
we'll talk a little bit about timing in a bit.
Marlia, is that branched chain amino acids that you would supplement with during training so that you avoid breaking down the protein and reconverting it into
Yes, if you look at the literature around branched chain supplementation, they're predominantly looking at right before consumption, drinking it during, and then monitoring muscle damage post-exercise and consecutive testing sessions, and we see less muscle damage with branched chain amino acid supplementation during exercise. The idea being is that we're not reliant on some of our muscle stores as a source of energy. We now have another route of calories for that, in addition to carbohydrate. And we'll see why we actually might benefit from that because there is a whole limiting step in how much carbohydrate we can actually consume. So carbohydrates, we think, oh, bagels, pastas, blah, 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 but don't forget your fruit, lots of vegetables, corn, peas, potato, yams are all a little bit starchier, more carbohydrate. Cereal, beans, great source of carbohydrates, and our dairy products. So it's not just the grain group. We have lots of other groups that contribute to carbohydrate. Yeah.
Does the GI have anything to do with which of those carbohydrates we consume?
The GI, in the sense of digestion and absorption, depends on the individual. Someone might be lactose intolerant. Someone might have celiac disease, and so they don't tolerate gluten and wheat products. There could be some variability in that.
So looking at the higher, the lower end of the scale, maybe more of a mixed diet is probably
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about low and high glycemic index foods, and certainly the lower ones are more sustainable. The higher ones raise your blood sugars very quickly. You'll see during training you actually want more high than low. But as part of your diet for better blood sugar control between meals, the lower glycemic index. But we can really change the glycemic index of any carbohydrate. You add some nuts to it, a piece of cheese to it, a peanut butter, a slice of chicken to it, and you've changed the glycemic index. So it's not, if you eat it by itself, it may raise it. You combine it with like a banana. You have half banana, blood sugars will change. Half banana with a tablespoon of peanut butter, you get leveled out.
So dairy is really a good source of carbo?
For each cup of milk, it's about 12 grams. You can find yogurts with 40 grams of carbohydrate. Kefirs in the 30s per cup. Yeah. Now you do lights, and you're a little bit different. The Greek yogurts are less. Fage, only 9 grams per cup. The Chobani is only about 17 grams per cup, so there's a little bit difference there. Soy milks would definitely be in that. Component rice milks, almond milks would be in that area too. Now, protein's certainly important. We talked quite a bit about this in the weight loss, given that it's significant for satiety, feelings of fullness between meals. We should evenly distribute our protein intake. But as athletes, you require more than someone just off the street because you have constant muscle breakdown. You need rebuilding, and not only rebuilding to previous standards, but we want them to be stronger, so we need even more ingredients for that. So as your exercise increases volume and intensity, you actually require a bit more protein. It's certainly an important part of our immune system this time of year, making sure you're getting enough protein, not only for your training, but also for keeping up a healthy immune system so you stay on your bike. And as we'll talk about with recovery, it's actually a really important part of recovery that only in the last few years has been given more credit in the sense of it being necessary at that end rather than only focusing on carbohydrate. So the best sources of protein, obviously shellfish, or beans and grains can be a good source of protein, especially when combined together. Eggs, egg whites, egg substitutes, dairy products, all great sources of protein. There's a lot of soy-based products, whether it's a soy substitute in the sense of a meat substitute, or tofu, or edamame, great sources of protein. And then there also are protein powders that aren't necessarily something you have to have in the diet. It really depends on the individual and their dietary choices. And the convenience around protein. Protein typically involves something that needs prepared or kept cool or some kind of environmental control. Powder can be just added to a thing of milk that you bought at the cafeteria at work. It can be added to your oatmeal while you're running off to work in the morning for convenience. But do you have to have a protein powder? No. But depending on your diet, it may be convenient, it may also be helpful. Yeah?
Is there a maximum amount of protein, grams of protein you could take in one serving?
In one serving?
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like if you have tuna fish and you put a scoop of protein powder and stuff, is there an excess of that where you can't?
Our body's pretty good at absorbing about 99% of all the food we consume.
Really?
Yeah. You'll probably feel a little bit more GI distress because it's really going to slow down the gut. It's going to sit in your stomach longer. So you might feel pretty full a long period of time. Not that that's bad, but you will digest and absorb all of that protein. And then that protein, whether it's from fish or the powder or milk or soy milk or nuts, is digested to the basic unit amino acid. It's absorbed across the intestine into the blood, and then the body does whatever it wants with it. But it's not identified as I'm from fish and the same amino acids as I'm from soy. They're not differentiated, they're the same amino acids and are used in constant body turnover of protein. Yes?
So, are you saying that protein takes more time to digest, is that right, than a carbohydrate or whatever?
Typically, because it slows down, it's the emptying of the stomach. And the stomach, the only part of the stomach that's digesting and breaking down in the sense of opening up the 3D structure and allowing for more surface area. There's no absorption in the stomach except for alcohol.
So during the endurance event, you mentioned, that you should take some protein. Is there some kind of way to know what that maximum should be during
It's about typical research, especially around branched chain amino acids, about 7 to 12 grams an hour. Some people can tolerate more. I think it also depends on the event. If you're out for the double century, you're not killing yourself. You're doing a 50-mile road race, you're probably not going to do a whole lot of protein because you're at high intensity. And if you've got stuff sitting in your gut too long, you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable. There's not a lot of blood flow in the gut when you're at a real high intensity. All the blood flows to your extremities. So it's definitely a balance in the sense of the duration of the event, the intensity of the event, and then whether you've even practiced it or not. But your typical Clif Bar is 10 grams, as an example. Yeah.
So 5.7 is that like the 0.5 is on the lower range for women, 0.7 more for men?
Good question. There's no gender specifics around protein requirements, unfortunately. The recommendations mostly around the amount of exercise you're doing. The more you do, the more you need. But typically endurance athletes don't need any more than this, or 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilo. Strength training athletes might do more about 1.6 or more. There's some argument that anything beyond 1.6, there was a review paper recently that anything beyond 1.6 grams per kilo, there's no additional benefit for an athlete. But I don't see many strength or bodybuilders, they really don't need me. They don't think they need me, so I don't see them. But they're definitely doing more than that. I just listened to a physician the other day. I was walking down the stairs and he was telling these two residents, yeah, endurance athletes, they need 2 to 3 grams of protein per pound. I was like, passing on wrong information, but who am I to correct you in front of your compatriots? Not me, but that was totally wrong. And those recommendations, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilo for endurance athletes, have been long-standing. They're well-researched. They haven't made many changes. There's really not much more that they need. Yeah.
Now, is that per body weight or like lean body mass?
That's a really good question because you're bringing up a group of athletes that are becoming, we have a lot of athletes that have gone through bariatric surgery and we have to account for that weight change. All of that's based on body weight.
So
fat mass, lean mass together.
So, okay.
So, how do you looking at, I'll look at that in addition to food records and distribution and percentage of the calories. Because typically we're also trying to work on weight loss with that patient client.
Does it make sense that it's total weight? I mean.
No.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't, but, you know, when all these recommendations for athletes are we pick out any research study on an athlete, and it's your 25-year-old male with a VO2 max of 55, and you're just like, okay, how does this apply to my 60-year-old age grouper who's, carrying 5, 10 extra % body fat? There's no answer. Yeah.
On your weeks that you're not training as intensely, you should cut your protein back some, or just keep it at the same level.
That's a good point. Typically, you're going to cut back the carbohydrate because in the weeks you're doing less, you want to maintain your muscle tissue, and that protein's part of that, keeping that up. So whenever you're cutting back on calories for less training as a reflection or weight loss, the protein should really stay the same. So that's where the percentage of that pie chart will flux a bit depending on where you are in your cycle. Not menstrual cycle. Okay. So fat is certainly important. Athletes should not be on a fat-free diet. Typical recommendations, 1 gram per kilo. I think looking at, what types of fats are you consuming? We want healthy fats. Do we get some fat in the diet through that? I mean, we're not necessarily counting grams all the time, but we usually get plenty of fat. But it's certainly an important part. Again, we're using fat as a source of energy right now when you're on your bike, so it's not that we're going to be on a fat-free diet. But certainly the calories add up very quickly. So a tablespoon of peanut butter is 100 calories. Handful of nuts, 28 almonds is 160 calories. Open can, empty can, there's 600 calories right there. So fat can add up very quickly. Bruce just tested one of my athletes today who's lost 15 pounds, and Bruce asked him, so, how'd you do that? Well, apple and peanut butter became 800 calories.
It was healthy though.
It was healthy though, right. And olive oil is really good for you, no doubt, but it doesn't mean you get a cup a day. A lot of calories. I've argued with patients over that. So there's lots of healthy fats. Your vegetarian fats are the best choices. The fish is a great fat. Flaxseed oil, flaxseed meal are very healthy fats. But, whole avocado will run you 350 to 400 calories. So it adds up pretty quickly. It's a healthy fat. I'm not going to argue about that, but it's calories. And if you're trying to figure out where your calories are coming from, why can't I lose weight? Well, we sometimes have to look at these foods and how much we're using. So we can just scoop out of the jar and eat and walk and scoop again as we walk through. Yeah?
Now, for really long endurance events, would there be any necessity to replace fat? Like to take fat in, like during like an Ironman event or a half Ironman? I mean, do you need to take in fat?
You don't there's no argument for fat consumption during training and during long endurance. However, usually long endurance athletes are craving that kind of food. You go to these 24-hour events and they're eating Pop-Tarts and Paydays and M&Ms and they need chips, handfuls. They're eating all of that because the calorie deficit is so great.
So
But
they're just going for calories, not necessarily.
They're doing it more for calories. Maybe they need something other than a sweet sugary goo or another peanut butter jelly sandwich. But also the calorie deficit per hour is so great that sometimes you just have to, you just eat those sorts of things just to make up for that deficit. But you then have to think about, okay, what's my intensity? You're doing a 100-mile run race and you're kind of plodding along. You're not, sprinting. You're going to have enough oxygen to help kind of move that food through, digest, and allow for some blood flow in the gut to keep that process moving. Good question. So supplementation, we had a nice argument about what works, what doesn't work. I think we walked away with the fact that there's caffeine, certainly during exercise, is shown to improve performance, also shown to increase carbohydrate absorption. There's no argument over caffeine. If you don't drink caffeine, you don't feel compelled to start a caffeinated supplement during exercise. But there's a lot of benefits to that. We talked a little bit about creatine supplementation for the bulking up kind of athlete. Usually cyclists aren't interested in that. But everything else was, we had ranges of 30 milligrams to 30 grams for benefit. The bottom line is there is so much kind of sketchy research out there that there's not, and these are, group of nutrients that are not well monitored by the Food and Drug Administration, so we can't rely on them. There's no research at this point, except for vitamin C, that suggests athletes need any more B vitamins, B6, B12, B1, B2, B3, folate, or need any more of any other nutrient. Maybe vitamin C is an antioxidant. Typically, the athlete's eating enough and more. They're getting 150%. They're getting 200%. You don't need to add 4,000% to a supplement.
Marlia,
Yes.
athlete or not, but age.
Uh-huh.
I mean, age is an issue. The turnover of your cells and all that stuff. So there's no documentation that says an older athlete needs a little bit different than.
That's not well studied. The master athletes have not been well studied, but if you take away the athlete part and you just look at the age part, there are so many research studies that look at supplementation of vitamins, minerals, or multivitamin. There's not one lick of benefit. There's just a recent publication a couple months ago. There's just no change. Now, aside from sheer deficiencies, vitamin D deficiency, osteoporosis, any kind of anemias requiring B12 or iron, totally separate from that, there's no other literature.
As a subject, I would say that a little bit of red wine is not too bad.
That's right. Here, right? How many ounces, right? So, yeah, it seems like we would need more, one with age, one with exercise, but there's no literature that even suggests that. Again, aside from deficiency and repletion, there's nothing else extra that we need. Typically eat enough. When you look at your Cliff Bar, it's practically a multivitamin in itself. Why do you need another one? Hydration is very important. Drinking enough fluids. Obviously, we think about, this time of year I might not have to drink as much, but you're in a building, there's heat, you're losing water through breathing, so you want to stay hydrated. We tend to focus on drinking more in the summertime because we're hot and we're visibly sweaty. But, fatigue, loss of appetite, poor concentration, this whole maybe afternoon sort of lull. Are you drinking enough fluid? Dark urine, muscle cramps can also be associated with overall hydration status. There are recommendations. A good way to check how hydrated you are is the color of your urine. Pale yellow, almost clear is your goal. And how frequently you're urinating, every 2 to 4 hours is the goal there. Yeah?
About rehydration.
Uh-huh.
Water with salt, or
We'll talk about that with recovery.
All right.
Yeah. So the current recommendations for fluid requirements, and sorry for any of you greater than 50, you have no requirement. What are we going to do, Dr. Matthew? They're pretty, we can consider the fact that you probably need at least as much,
no wine.
maybe a little bit less. We associate with age with less muscle mass, but we also associate with age not drinking enough fluid and dehydration. So again, these are just recommendations in a thermoneutral environment, no physical activity, you're not shivering, you're not sweating. These requirements can be met through both beverages and food. So your yogurt's fluid, your fruit's fluid, your vegetables are fluid. The recommendations also said that you could include caffeinated beverages. However, if you're drinking all 15 cups from coffee, we need to talk. And then certainly, again, the physical activity component. This is your base, and then we increase our fluid requirements with physical activity because of the loss with sweat. Now, certainly we'll talk a little bit about fluid requirements during physical activity, but what happens now, June, September, total different sweat rates. And fluid requirements definitely going to vary.
And the last one is the difference between male and female because of body mass,
Yes.
muscle.
Yes, body mass is a big deal, and composition is a big deal. Men have more muscle tissue, there's more water in muscle tissue, women have more fat tissue, there's no water. So let's look at that week before. Again, initially you're going to probably eat a pretty normal diet. Maybe you have a big competition on Saturday or Sunday. Depending on your training plan, there's some training plans that argue a couple days. You know, the first and second day you might have some depletion of your glycogen stores for physical activity, and then you get a couple more days of rest before your big event. Not every trainer is practicing that. But a couple of days you're going to at least rest or do less prior to your event. Your calories may drop because you're not out for 3 hours, but the carbohydrate percentage of your calories should increase. That's the idea behind carbohydrate loading. It's not the night before. It's part of what you do on a day-to-day basis with your training, and also part of it what's going on a couple of days before your training. So, you know, you eat 3,000, 3,200 calories on high training days. You might only need 2,500 or less on lower training days, but that high percentage of carbohydrates a little bit bigger, more carbohydrate. When you're resting or doing less, the body wants to repair and refuel. And it'll take everything you give it and be able to really maximize your opportunity on Saturday or Sunday. So you want to make sure you're getting enough carbohydrate. You might start to choose a little bit less fiber in your foods because fiber is a non-digestible form of carbohydrate. It goes through all 23 feet of your intestine whole, hence why we have less constipation with fiber, but you don't absorb it. So you're missing out on a few grams of fiber to digest and absorb if you have a very high fiber diet. So you might cut back a little bit on that. Keep in mind, we store water with carbohydrate in our glycogen stores, so you may see a weight change, a pound or two. The morning of the event, that's also a nice reflection of have a little more hydration on you, because now you have a little extra fluid plus your glycogen stores. But the night before, pigging out is unnecessary. The idea sounds good. It's good for a social excuse, but it's not in the best interest of your performance the next day. So that night before, Friday night, Saturday night, or the day before, I should say, you're going to consume high carbohydrate foods, drink plenty of fluid to keep up with the storage of glycogen, keep up your hydration. About 20% of your glycogen is depleted after an overnight fast. So you can certainly consider a small snack prior to bed to reduce that depletion for the next morning. You have less to make up prior to your event. Especially if you're one that doesn't tolerate food very well because of anxiety, nerves, or frustration, or just being out of town or whatever, and don't eat a lot prior to the event, you definitely want to have that evening snack. Now, do you have to feel super full and sick? No. It's just portion control, a couple pretzels, maybe a half a banana or something small. The day before is not a good time to try new foods. So the local Mexican restaurant would not be my recommendation prior to a big event. You want easily digestible. You might not do a lot of salad. You might do more cooked vegetables where the fiber is broken down and you're able to absorb most of that. And then the big tri-tip, you don't need that the night before, half the pork tenderloin, the rest is for the family. You don't need to be doing that. Too much fat, too much protein is really going to slow down digestion, probably make you feel pretty uncomfortable the next morning because you probably still have food sitting in there. And again, it's not the protein we need, we're looking at the carbohydrate prior to the event to fill up that gas tank. This is just an example menu. It's about 2,500 calories. It's about 65% carbohydrate, but we have 3 meals, 3 snacks. Anyone ever get 4 ounces of frozen yogurt? Not me. But we're talking about small portions here frequently, but it still adds up to almost 2,500 in the sense of carbohydrate at the meals. You're getting a little bit of protein at the meals, 3 ounces of lean turkey. That's only the size of a deck of cards. Small. Cup of cooked rice, the size of a fist. You're not overdoing it here. This isn't like hometown buffet. Round 2. So think about portion size. We don't have to overdo it. We just want that percentage of the pie to be more carbohydrate in the interest of your gas tank, your glycogen stores. 100-mile ride, or maybe you have a 50-mile bike ride, even a race. American College of Sports Medicine recommends we eat 2 to 4 hours prior to the event. That time frame definitely is individual dependent. Cyclists can put a lot of calories away and get on their bike and ride. Runners are a different story, swimmers are a different story. So it really depends on the person. You have to think about your travel time and the sense of if you have to drive there, if you're trying to figure out where you're going to, how you're going to get there because you're not familiar with the place. Those things need to be taken into consideration around that time. But the goal is that it's a large enough meal, anywhere from 400 to 800 calories. Obviously, that's dependent on size, too. Even though I had a woman who put away at least 800 calories for breakfast prior to a race. That's not the most common. It's usually the men. The women are doing the less. But it's mostly carbohydrate. The goal is that you have still a little bit left in the gut for absorption at the onset of the event. So now you're not going into the event hungry or feeling like your stomach's empty, that there's a little bit still left over. So there's carbohydrate at this meal with a little bit of protein, maybe a little bit of fat, but not predominantly. It's going to be mostly carbohydrate. And the closer you are you get to your, so let's say due to complications, it's 2 hours before. The smaller that meal is going to be. The further out you are from your time, the larger the meal can be. You can tolerate more calories because you have more time to digest those calories. So certainly getting enough carbohydrate there. It really can depend on the person. There's some people who can do oatmeal, some people who wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Peanut butter sandwiches are common. Some people can do some eggs with toast and some milk. Others would balk at that. So it really is dependent on the person, and that this is a meal that's something you've already done. It's not the first time you've been on your bike for 100 miles, so what did you do last time? And was it enough? Was it too much? Was there enough carbohydrate, or was it mostly an omelet? We have to maybe make some changes there. But oftentimes, too, I have athletes, because of nerves and stress and anxiety, tolerate more liquid calories versus hard, chewable calories. Ensures, boosts, are oftentimes well tolerated prior to an event. Liquid calories just go down easier. And you have to get something in. Going in thinking that you're not going to just have half a banana and you're calling it good is not enough. Not enough. We've done enough time trials at sports medicine, looked at research, and we have this fixed breakfast prior to each time trialing event. Oh, I'd never eat that much. Oh gosh, there's so much food, blah, blah, blah. They eat it and they actually do better and they feel really good. So it's important that you get some foods, but it does also matter what you can tolerate, and that takes some experimentation on your part. Some people will have a little snack 30 to 60 minutes before the start. I think that's typically helpful, especially if the start's been delayed. You know, maybe there's been a crash on the course and they have to wait 30 minutes or so. Your meal's now 4.5 hours away from the start. Yeah.
Is a snack considered like a goo, or is a snack okay?
Goo, banana, something real simple carbohydrate at that point, just to get some food in, ready for absorption, not a lot of digestion going on. It might just be sport drink, but it's not going to be like a couple bites of turkey sandwich or cheese stick or something like that. It's mostly carbohydrates. There is some argument or some research that saw that people, when they consumed a carbohydrate like a gel, you see that a lot at the start, someone's throwing down a gel, that there's in some research we see a dip in blood sugars at the onset of the event, but there's no performance change. And there's some research that doesn't find that dip. So I think it really is independent of the person. And if that's something like we're pretty superstitious as athletes, gotta do it, or I'm not gonna do well today, you're clear to do that.
Is it like an insulin response? You get a bunch of sugar in really quick and the body tries to compensate for it? Okay.
Yeah, we get a little bit of a combination of drop there, and the physical activity is going to change your sugars just by itself.
So that's why 30 to 60 minutes to let that happen if it's going to happen. Okay.
Yes, and that if you at least have that happen prior to physical activity, because the physical activity itself is going to play a role in your sugars. So you compound that with the insulin, and you'll see a bigger drop. But again, there was no performance difference. There was no perceived exertion changes, and it was a transient change of blood sugar.
So really, at that point, you're talking about comfort.
Yeah, time's been delayed, and you planned so perfectly at your 4 hours, and now, you know, you're kind of stuck, but you're feeling a little grumble, get something in. So you don't want to start hungry, though. The closer you get to the start, the predominant the carbohydrates. The further you get away, you can add some protein in, you can add some fat in, and have a real food rather than a bar or something. So let's look at fuel during exercise. Again, going back to this glycogen depletion during 90 minutes of intense cycling, again, 65 to 75% or so, pretty high intensity. By 90 minutes or so, assuming your tank is full, you're going to run out of glycogen stores. Now, if your tank's not full, you're going to hit that point sooner. Or bonking, hitting a wall, lead legs, all that plays a role right in here. So because of this, the American College of Sports Medicine, National Athletic Trainers Association, and amongst other associations have looked at carbohydrate supplementation because as glycogen levels run out, blood sugars drop. We know what happens when we have a low blood sugar. Performance drops, perceived exertion goes up, and you hate the sport. So, don't let that happen, but that's the argument behind carbohydrate supplementation. Exercise lasting longer than an hour needs carbohydrate supplementation. I would even argue some athletes might need it even if they're only training for an hour, depending on when their last meal was, or snack, and what kind of training. You're doing hill repeats or intervals, you probably would benefit from some carbohydrates. Yes?
How is that in relation to keeping yourself hydrated during that time? Will you bonk sooner if you're not hydrating yourself?
So the hydration's totally separate from this. This is just blood sugars, and it's reliant on your stores. If you're dehydrated and you haven't consumed carbohydrate, then you're in a world of hurt.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but if the hydration would partially affect your glycogen stores because we're drawing out more water, and we might use up those glycogen stores a little bit more, and you might run out sooner rather than the 90-minute mark. Yeah.
Can I add one thing apropos of this question?
Yes.
In marathon runners, usually there are people offering constantly something to drink. They run and drink. They run and drink. And it was found that actually those who usually win, if you check the weight of the first 4, 5, 6 on arrival, their weight is less than they had at start.
Yes.
Then those coming later, they have an increased weight because of the amount of water that they have been drinking.
They've also been on the course for 4 hours rather than 2 hours. So their exposure time is different. But there's also plenty of argument about hyponatremia on people who are on the course for a longer period of time because they've overwatered the plant.
As usual, you're splendid. Bravo.
So the American College of Sports Medicine, the American Dietetic Association, Canada's Dietetic Association, there was a recent position paper that just reevaluated carbohydrate requirements, and they remain unchanged at 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour for exercise lasting longer than an hour. Now, pretty big range, so obviously women probably going to be on the lower end of the range, men might be on the higher end of the range, but I'll show you in a second an argument where we might even get more carbohydrate. The fluid requirements, because of Dr. Navazio's point, were altered recently through position paper. Reps are requiring less fluid per hour because it seems we tend to drink too much. We also drink sometimes too much water and not enough electrolytes. But the requirements have dropped down to 2 to 8 fluid ounces every 15 to 20 minutes. 8 fluid ounces would be for someone like 90 kilo. Big guy, versus the women might only be doing 2 to 4 ounces. They're down at the 50, 60 kilo. So the smaller you are, the less fluid you require. Makes sense. The bigger you are, the more fluid you require. The challenge behind that is you have 2 water bottle cages. And if you're lucky, you have one on your back seat. Yeah?
And you say it says eat carbohydrates. Now, are you saying that separate from the exercise?
No, that's separate from the sport drink, or, I'm sorry, I cut you off earlier.
Well, you said eat carbohydrates, and below it you have drink use sports drink.
So during exercise, we want to eat carbohydrate, and we need to drink fluids as well.
Okay.
They can both be met per hour from the same product. I had a triathlete or I should say an Ironman athlete who did all calories from fluid. So every bottle had 400 plus calories. She concentrated her beverage, and that's what worked for her. So she met fluid and sugar and salt. That's the nice thing about sport drinks is they do all of the above in that.
Now, do you want to start replacing carbohydrates right away? Like if you know exercise is going to be over an hour, do you wait like 30 minutes then start drinking carbs, or?
You can certainly, that's a good question. Typically research will jump right into 15, 20 minutes and start carbohydrate supplementation and monitor blood sugars with minimal change. So there's no time delay on that. I think it also depends on, you just went for pancake breakfast with your buds prior to your 75-mile ride, you probably are going to be okay for the first hour, right? But if it's been a few hours, there was a delay, you're probably going to want to start it on it sooner.
What's the onset of absorption though?
Pretty quick. Again, the absorption's not occurring in the stomach though, it's on the small intestine. So it has to get through the stomach to the small intestine. The idea is you still have food from your small intestine that are from the meal prior to your event that's being absorbed. The sugar and the fluid's going to move pretty quickly through, and then the absorption rate is going to happen probably within the first 15 minutes or so. Now, the more fat you add to that, the different story. Yeah.
Can having food in your digestive tract, like maybe some fat or protein or something, can that actually help slow down the loss rate or absorption of sugar or carbohydrate as it goes through your system?
It does. It slows down the emptying of the stomach into the small intestine. Now that's a positive thing when it comes to meal and weight loss in particular. But on the bike, you now have something sitting there longer, requiring more blood flow to that area for digestion and the movement of food through. So you actually are doing yourself a disservice having that food sit there longer. Unless again you have plenty of oxygen, you're doing a lower intense exercise, you're out hiking for 8 hours, this is sort of a different thing. But when it comes to cycling, someone could go off the front, you gotta go chase them down, and then, it's like this accordion, and you're sitting there trying to fumble around with peanut butter and jelly, it's probably not gonna be a good idea. Yeah. So, when it comes to hydration, you want to drink, a sport drink is very helpful because it does meet the fluid requirement, the sugar requirement, and the salt requirement. There are percentages that are optimal for absorption, so you don't get kind of oftentimes if we consume too much carbohydrate, not enough fluid, we get gastric distress. The gut has to put water in there to just help dissolve all of that and move it through, and so that just takes time and it's uncomfortable. So, you don't have to do a sport drink though. You don't have to, but you do need to make sure you're getting enough salt. Those recommendations I've looked at because of the hyponatremia concern. And it's really interesting. You can look at research studies. There was a study done with 700 milligrams of sodium per hour, and they still saw no change in hyponatremia risk. So the recommendation is 250 to 500 milligrams per hour physical activity. So example, your gel here has 30. Power gel, after the whole hyponatremia thing in the Boston Marathon, this goes back a few years, has 200 milligrams per gel. So big difference. Your sport drink, the Hammer Heat here has 40 milligrams per packet. So not necessarily, you may or you may not be getting enough. It depends on your product. And I'm not a spokesperson for anyone, I'm just reporting that. Yes.
Excuse me, a question specifically about the different products. I had a conversation with one of the reps online about the fact that they use stevia. And they don't use, their policies not to use, I hate the taste of stevia to start with. But I just have a question about what that does to the utility. I mean, they're not using sugars.
Right.
So.
Well, that's the thing around these products. That I've seen recovery products that are the total exact opposite. That's a perfect, there's sport drinks, Propel. It's like there's 10 calories a cup. That's not enough. That's, don't bother purchasing that. So there can be pretty misleading, especially if they're putting some artificial sweetener here, because that's the thing.
Well, they call it a natural sweetener.
Yeah, of course. Well, it is natural. It's
Yeah.
a plant, but the problem is it's not going to support its performance.
Yeah.
And that's, it's just marketing. It's just a marketing component of the whole
Yeah,
thing.
and they're in the Double Century Planet Ultra uses all Emerald products.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay.
Yeah, that's the challenging part. So when you're on the course, you're bringing your own, you're going to rely on theirs, and if you're going to rely on theirs, try it before you do it, because sometimes it doesn't taste so good when you're hot and sweaty. Yeah.
Do you have any favorites as far as the kind of sugars in these drinks? Because some drinks like that Heat is pure maltodextrin.
I'll show you a
Others-
graph in a second that's going to hone in on that
Okay.
exact question. Was there another question about
Yeah,
that?
so with the salt, is it important to balance that with the other, like, potassium and other electrolytes? And if,
Go.
and if so, how do you put that all together?
That's a really good question. And, Dr. Matsu smiles. We were just talking about the whole cramp issue. If you look at fluid requirements for athletes, electrolyte requirements, there's only discussion of salt. There's no discussion of potassium, there's no discussion of magnesium, there's no discussion of calcium. Now, it's not to say there isn't any research out there that looks at that, because typically what they're going for is cramping, avoiding cramping, getting enough electrolytes. Well, really, you look at the research around muscle cramps, and it's a laundry list of causes. And you just might not be physically fit, hate to say it to you, or you might have some, some nervous system firing that's overfiring in that area, and you're just having a bad day, or you're psychologically psyched yourself out because every time you go by that creek, you got a cramp. All those play a role, but your hydration and sodium are the two top ones. There's no argument for calcium, there's no magnesium or potassium recommendations beyond what you're just getting in food and what companies put in food. Yeah. Yes?
What if you're on high blood pressure medicines and you're trying to watch your sodium
Yeah.
and trying to get extra potassium? I don't take any drinks with sodium.
Uh-huh.
I realize that's probably not good.
Probably not the best on the bike. Around your other dietary components, but when it's not, when you're training, and especially if you're a heavy sweater and your dog licks your legs when you get home, you got the salt, then you probably need more salt than the average person. Now remember, your sweat rate now is different from June, it's different when it's 104 outside. So your sodium requirements may change. It's very difficult to assess all of that. But during physical activity, sodium is important for replacement. Because then, again, it also holds on to water. So if you drink only water and you have a fig Newton or two, and that's your kind of hourly thing, you're not having any sodium to hold on to that water. You're probably going to have to pee sooner than you want to, because the kidneys are just going to flush that out. There's no electrolytes for retention. Typically, if you look at all the literature, water's compared to sport drink, water compared to gels, water compared to raisins, water compared to honey, water always does the poorest. It never does well in the sense of performance, time to exhaustion, perceived exertion rate. So carbohydrate supplementation is important, and people who drink sport drink will drink more fluid than water and stay better hydrated as well.
Doesn't the increased calcium in some of the sport drinks, because I know they vary, the sport drinks that you find higher in calcium, higher in magnesium, potassium, they actually, the four of them, actually, well, three of the four, they actually help with the binding effect in the wall, in the absorption rate into the body, actually, than you find like products like Heat that have less of all four.
Actually, when it comes to absorption, your GLUT4 transporters in your gut rely solely on sodium. And everything else is absorbed, but not part of that process. So, and if you look at the, some of, not these products, but other ones that have like E-caps and those sorts of things, they're like 30, 40 milligrams. They're small in the big picture, so it's a bit misleading on their actual contribution.
So, would you then say, like, increasing your salt intake like the night before an event, does that help you with water?
That's a good, a good question. The night before, the morning of may help. Maybe the salt loading the week before, if you have good kidneys, don't bother. But you could do a little extra kind of, some people call it hyperhydration, a little extra fluid, a little extra salt to retain that. Sure, absolutely. Midwest, they do, football players, you know, they've got some spring training out in 99-degree temperature with 99% humidity. Someone comes off the field with a muscle cramp, he's given a shot of pickle juice.
Yeah.
And then go back out on the field.
Pickle juice.
So, salt, salt definitely plays a role. Yeah. Yeah.
About 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. What about ultra endurance?
Yeah.
You're out there 24 hours, 30 hours, your metabolism shutting down. What's different?
What's different
What's
is,
different?
well, again, it goes back to your intensity. You're out there for that many hours, you're not killing yourself every hour. You can tolerate a lot more calories, a lot more fat and protein, so you're not relying on solely sport drink and salt, or solely sport drink and gels. You do need salt, you do need fluid, and you need calories at that point. And whatever you can tolerate under the intensity that you're competing, yeah, carbs are going to be important, but you've got room for fat and protein. The deficit per hour times X number of hours is greater than you could ever need in a gel per hour. The branched chain amino acids are very commonly supplemented in endurance athletes because there's so much chronic muscle breakdown. These athletes have multiple hours per day, and so branched chain amino acid supplementation, in addition to the carbohydrates, shown to reduce muscle damage. But there's also a great argument because it's all extra calories. You're burning 400, 500, 600, maybe more calories per hour, and you're getting 60 grams of carbohydrate. That's 240 calories. You still have a big gap. You're never going to match one for one. The body's not built to do that during exercise. But you can certainly reduce the deficit with protein, as an example, 7 to 12 grams. And then these longer endurance, you can do more fat calories too, because the intestines have the blood flow to do that. Yeah.
How do you measure the branched chain amino acids and hourly intake?
Well, if you're doing supplements like Accelerate or Excel gels where they're talking about branched chain amino acids, then you can calculate how much you're consuming per hour. 7 to 12 grams is a typical dose for research. The downside is how many branched chain amino acids are in your Cliff Bar. Typically proteins are about 20% branched chain amino acids. So there's 10 grams of protein, you got 2 grams of branched chain amino acid. Maybe. Hard to say.
What did you say the level you want of branched chain amino acids?
7 to 12 an hour. Again, for endurance. You're out there for an hour and a half, 2 hours, but you have chronic 3-4 hour, and then you're the type that also has to go run, swim, the whole gamut, right? Athletes do it all. Then you have a lot of muscle breakdown. You certainly would benefit from branched chain amino acid supplementation.
I missed that lecture last time, but how would you do it? What would you do for supplementation?
Typically, just aiming for products that have it. So Hammer has some, like Perpetuum has more protein in it. Accelerate, Sport Drink has it. There's a couple other products out that have. So you're looking for the Sport Drink that's going to have probably, as it's up here, a 3-to-1 ratio of grams to protein in the interest of attaining some branched chain amino acids, even though you may not be getting what you're aiming for because they're not specific.
But it's more than right, higher.
Yes, a little, yeah, your typical Gatorade Zero, as an example.
So you
Yeah.
said,
Oh. Go ahead.
Okay. Salt loss, is that fairly typical from person to person, or does it vary genetically, women, men?
It varies a lot.
A lot?
It does.
Okay, so some people are saltier than others?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. How do you figure out who you are?
Well, you
Which
have
one
to,
you
by, again, are you the crystallized all over your helmet straps? You got the ring on you could practically dust off some on your chips sort of thing. Yeah, you have a lot of salt. If you're not that kind of person, you have less salt.
So
But is there a
500 for you then, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Did you want me to have another comment?
no, I just had a question. So you just said there was a product that has 3 to 1. Is that 3 carbohydrates to 1?
That was what you might be looking for if you're trying to attain more protein. Would be that.
And the protein brings you more branched chain amino acids.
That would be the assumption. That would be the assumption. Unless they're advertising, the assumption would be that you're getting more branched chain amino acids by getting protein in general. But if it's not listed and it's going to be 20% of the protein. That's the typical, if we had a piece of meat or a piece of fish or some beans, are about 20% branched chain amino acids.
Hey, Marla, could you just go over just briefly what the study was that we did at UC about branched chain amino acids and what they did?
Well, so Bruce participated in one of our infamous studies, and we had products made. It was 7 to 12 grams of carbohydrate, or of branched chain amino acids, in addition to the carbohydrate. And their dosage was based on body weight, so not everyone got the same amount. It was a matter of total mils and grams of carbohydrate per kilo, so there's some variety there. The idea originally, about 8 years ago, even up to 10 years ago, that branched chain amino acids would offset the release of serotonin from the brain through tryptophan and not make someone tired, right? It will delay the onset of fatigue if we delay the release of serotonin. Well, over the last, 10 years, that's really not come to fruition. However, we do see really good results in reduction of blood tests that associate with muscle damage, like creatine kinase. We see less muscle damage with protein consumption during physical activity. The branched chain amino acids in particular. Again, calorie deficit, I'll show you in a second, you can only absorb so much carbohydrate per hour. You absorb a few extra calories, you're not relying on some of your own muscle tissue as a source of calories, because you can convert your muscle tissue protein to glucose. We can convert branched chain amino acids to glucose. We can just straight burn them up for a source of calories, source of energy. So it was interesting to see that, and most of the research now repeats those results. Reduction in muscle damage. Varying results in overall delay of onset of fatigue and changes in ultimate performance, but you do see reduction in muscle damage.
So basically giving the body another source,
of calories.
so it's not pulling it from your muscle tissue.
Right, so let's say you're doing 50 grams of carbs per hour, there's 200 calories. If I give you an extra 10 grams of protein, there's another 40. So the idea is that you're getting a little bit extra. So let's talk a little bit more about that carbohydrate during exercise. Carbohydrate during exercise, the idea is partially that will spare glycogen stores. You don't want to deplete your glycogen stores. It takes a long time to recover, and athletes, they're doing something the next day, they're doing something that night. There's always working on their glycogen stores. Total depletion is really going to make you, one, not perform well and put your immune system at risk. So, carbohydrate supplementation during physical activity is to reduce the depletion of your gas tank. Inevitably, you're out there long enough and you're going to. But studies show you consume carbohydrate during exercise, we always see better performance. But the trick with carbohydrate, this is why it's 30 to 60 grams, the rate limiting step to the burning of that carbohydrate in the blood is how quickly it gets absorbed. And unfortunately, single sugars like glucose just by itself max a gram per minute. Max. There's your rate limiting factor. You need that sugar, but the intestines are only going to do it about a gram a minute. Now, studies have shown you mix the sugars. This is kind of getting into your original question. You mix the sugars, glucose with fructose, with sucrose, maltodextrin. We now have multiple gates of absorption. It's not all glucose now. We have fructose as an option. And we can absorb more per minute. 1.2, 1.5 grams per minute. That means you're out there for hours and hours. You can do 75. You might even be able to do 80 or 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour because you've mixed your sugars. So, the next chart shows you the different sugars. The gray bars represent intake, grams per minute, so 1.8 grams per minute, 2.4 grams per minute. The front bar is the actual oxidation rate, or the burning of that carbohydrate as a source of energy in the body. So you can see glucose by itself, the more you give, the same result. You mix glucose with fructose, you get a better result than just glucose by itself at the same dose. You mix it with glucose and sucrose. Sucrose is glucose and fructose together. Same dose as fructose, you get same results. Not 100%, but better when you mix the sugars. Here's maltodextrin and fructose. A lot of products use maltodextrin. One, it's less sweet. People get tired of sweet stuff. But you mix maltodextrin and fructose at this dose, and we actually get better results than sucrose and glucose by itself. Maltodextrin is just 10 to 16 glucoses long. So we're not talking about major changes in chemistry here. We're just talking about a few extra bonds and a couple different types of sugar. Glucose and sucrose at an even higher dose, no difference. Glucose, fructose, and sucrose at a higher dose, we actually get better results than maltodextrin and fructose. And then glucose and fructose by itself. So products are mixing sugars now in an effort to try and absorb more sugar per hour. So you have a less calorie deficit per hour. Yeah?
Are there any options to getting sugar benefits without the sugars? Specifically, my wife is very sensitive to sugar, and with drinks, if she gets more than a drink that's got more than 10 grams of sugar in it, she gets over the edge, jittery, and can't even sit on the bike. She's all over the place.
Oh,
so her max load on sugar is about 15 grams an hour. That's about all she can handle. Are there any alternatives kind of help her?
You might play with the type of sugar. You know, might maybe do more of a maltodextrin beverage rather than a simple sugar beverage like Gatorade or Powerade. Cytomax is mostly maltodextrin too, so it's
Cytomax sends her
through the roof.
she doesn't have Cytomax. No, but she has the handle. She can handle it. It's accelerated high growth. That's all things that seems to sit with her.
Well, my interpretation would be that is that she's going to have to do her own kind of experimentation, but she's still in a pretty big calorie deficit. She might be able to do maybe a little bit other, what about just other foods? You're not reliant on only sport drink to eat. What if there's Fig Newtons or dried pears or pretzels or saltine crackers?
Yeah, we've tried
instead of sport drink.
That. The Fig Newtons are about the only other thing that's other than usually it's 1 or 2 hours right on the
And in addition to the sport drink too? And she's actually doing pretty well on her carbohydrate intake. There's 25 grams in 2 Fig Newtons, and then if she's saying doing another 15, so she's at 40 grams, that's fine per hour. Just want to make sure she's getting enough fluid, so she might have 15 in one bottle, and then the other bottle's water and some electrolytes just to keep up with the fluid requirement. But yeah, she's probably, if she can do at least that, that's fine. Yeah. Yes?
Harvard Nutrition states that they only use maltodextrin in their products, especially the gels, just because of that. And they think that studies like this, and I looked a couple of them up, they were done on people at a 50% rate of their VO2 max in the study. So their hypothesis is, since nobody's done a study on trained athletes, that maltodextrin is the way to go.
I'd have to look at the literature, but most people who participate in these research studies are pretty well trained. If you want to test anything, you start with the trained athlete, and then you go off to the other population. I would suspect that there's probably the same results or maybe even better results. I think with trained athletes, you have a far different efficiency system in the sense of a new athlete kind of starting a new product and getting used to something. But there's enough argument that maltodextrin is certainly an option. Now, is it the VO2 max a change in the sense of intensity, and can you tolerate maltodextrin at periods of time where you're 70 or 75% of your VO2 max? Probably, because you're not there very long. And there's a lot of processes going on. I would probably say they're fine. There's a lot of other foods that are coming into this. People aren't just relying on sport food, too. Yeah. Yes?
I make my own sport drinks, and I've used just maltodextrin and sucrose. I've been looking around for a source for fructose, and I can't find it. What would be a good commercial source for that?
Fruit juice would be an option.
It tends to, if you put it, it doesn't keep very well, like orange juice or something.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be a mix of fructose and sucrose and glucose, but that would probably be, aside from actually buying a chemistry of isolated fructose, that might be your closest source of fructose.
Would high fructose corn syrup be a good source for that?
It's still 50-50. It's still 50 glucose and 50 fructose.
You
You
could
can add
do
honey,
that and
you can do
maltodextrin.
table sugar or something like that, yeah. The trick is you only want about 6 to 8% of your carbohydrate solution coming from sugar to optimize absorption. So you want to make sure that your chemistry is right on how many grams of maltodextrin and fructose you're putting in there per ml of fluid. Yeah.
So what does this kind of equate to in calories per hour to bring in?
Well, so if we looked at, 1 point, get my calculator out. So to optimize mixed sugar and absorption, and let's say we're doing glucose, fructose, sucrose at 1.7 grams per minute, so 1.7 times 60 minutes in an hour times 4, there's 400 calories. It's pretty big. Does that mean you'll perform well? Well, no, get used to that. That's a lot. But, if you're out there for hours and hours and hours, you might do an hour that looks like that. The next hour might be less. Yeah.
So if I see 2 substances, is that 50-50? If I see 3, is it 33, 33, 33?
It's relatively evenly distributed. Okay. But in the big scheme of things, don't forget there's lots of sources of carbohydrate. You aren't reliant on sport products. He makes his own sport drink. You could put food coloring in and match your buddy on the bike. You don't have to do a gel. You don't have to do blocks or rocks or beans or all this other stuff. They're easy. They're 25 grams a packet. They might be 50 grams a packet. They're rip and swallow kind of stuff. But you're not relying 100% on them. You can do, 20 pretzels to match your goo. You can do 2 Fig Newtons to match your goo. You can do just your generic granola bars as options and not just the sport product. Joe?
So you were just saying that in the maximum efficiency, the most you can take back up is 400 calories an hour.
That would be, that's aside from any branched chain amino acid.
Okay, right.
So maybe an extra 40 calories.
So you're always going to have a deficit.
Always going to have a deficit. Your body is not in a place of it being anabolic and doing something with those calories other than sheer expenditure. Your body is not in a situation where they want enough blood flow at your gut. You want blood flow in your legs, and the more food you put in your gut, the less blood flow distribution you have to your legs. The slower your turnover rate, the reduced your RPM, the slower your pace. So it's a balance. Yeah.
Isn't it true that at a certain output, you no longer get a percentage back to your gut at all? Like 85% goes to the outlying muscle. So
right.
So in a sense, if you put in a baked potato or something like that, then
you're going to feel uncomfortable. There's not enough blood flow.
Right, and you won't digest it.
You won't digest it. It's going to sit there. You'll keep hoeing a bush. And
so is it better to take something in that might be absorbed through osmosis instead of digestion to keep going when you're going at a rate in a 2-hour fast road race?
You bring up a good point. There's a lot of interesting research about sugar mouthwash and just drinking it, consuming it, swishing it around, spitting it out has the same performance benefits of overall feelings of perceived exertion, feeling of time work, and overall time to fatigue just by doing that. So you're in a pinch,
spitting on the bike.
and you're, either you have to conserve because someone didn't meet you at the right place to give you another bottle, or you're in a high intent, like Criterium kind of stuff. Yeah, you could do some mouthwash, kind of just swish around some Gatorade and spit it at your buddy and get back at you. Yeah. But there's lots of other products. I've had athletes use pancakes, potatoes, roll them in salt or add some salt just for some extra sodium. Lastly, with recovery, this is very important. And along with the eating on your bike, a lot of athletes are, I'm trying to lose a few pounds, so I'm cutting back. That is not the place to cut back. You can cut back at dinner. You can cut back somewhere else. Do not cut back on your calories on the bike because you're going to sacrifice your performance, and what are you doing out there then if you're not going to fuel your performance? Recovery is important, especially with complete depletion. Very hard, long workout, first 30 minutes, you want to jump on it with carbohydrate. As soon as the body stops exercising, the hormones switch and it's ready to rebuild. and refuel, and we'll take every ingredient you give it, sugar included, and start on those glycogen stores. It's really important because I know all of you are going to go out, back out again the next day or another workout later in the day. You need those glycogen stores. You're going to work, or maybe you have to just sit there and listen to your spouse. You need sugar for the brain. Okay? So it's important the first 30 minutes that you get carbohydrates. Here's the trick. Post big ride, celebratory, you're going to Spaghetti Factory or Dos Coyotes or wherever, you're getting the big ranchero jobby with the champs, and don't forget the margarita, because you just busted your ass for 3 months to do this. That's not the way to recover. Sorry. I'm guilty myself. But one, the alcohol is not a way to recover fluid-wise, period. But second, if you look at studies that look at recovery, it's small meals every 2 hours up to 6 hours post-exercise. It's half that burrito and milk. 2 hours later, it's the other half of the burrito and some milk. It's not the whole burrito, 1,200 calories with the 400-calorie chips and the 600-calorie margarita. That's not the idea. It's small, every 2 hours to optimize recovery. That's where the calories, when someone's trying to lose weight, where we can play with calories. I'm starving when I get off the bike. You didn't eat enough. Come off the bike, here's some carbs. Have a half banana, finish the rest of your sport drink. Let's go and get yourself a sandwich, or go home and actually eat. Make yourself a sandwich, have some yogurt, a little bit of cereal, some fruit on it. A couple hours later, might be doing the same thing. A couple hours later, you're having dinner. But it's not the gorge. Yes?
Whey protein, which has some carbs and sugar, is that reasonable post-workout?
It depends on the protein. Whey itself is protein. Unless the powder's added sugar and carbs, it's an option.
Yeah, into milk.
Into milk, remember your milk's only 1-to-1 ratio. So you're not getting a lot of carbs there. You're going to want to add some fruit there. Maybe add some
Spaghetti.
What's that? Honey.
Spaghetti.
Spaghetti, yes. In your smoothie. So the whey powder has an option, but where's the rest of the carbohydrate? The whey powder is not going to refill your gas tank. So you still need twice the carbohydrate content from that powder. Your powder, Recoverite. Here's 32 grams of carbs and 10 grams of protein. You could put that in, maybe a little bit of whey powder in this and some milk, and be pretty good at more of a 2-to-1 ratio. This is more of a 3-to-1 ratio right now. But it's small. It's 500, 600 calories. For women, might be 400, and then broken up every 2 hours. It's not 2,000 calories. Yeah.
Are you trying to replenish the total deficit you just incurred?
Not all at once. You're trying to, the idea would be that ultimately you would make up for the deficit, and that still might occur the next day. It's not all going to happen the same day. The idea is that we're optimally giving you enough nutrients so your body can handle them and put them away appropriately, rather than the sheer volume of calories, and the body looks at that and goes, fat, because I don't know what else to do with all 2,000 calories of this meal. Rather than here's carb, protein, I can handle this, insulin puts away its glycogen, start rebuilding muscle tissue. 2 hours later, yeah, I can do that. So we want to allocate the nutrients in the most appropriate direction, and that's small, every couple hours. It also depends on depletion, too. You're out there for 2 hours, you probably didn't kill yourself. You're out there for 4, different story. Certainly getting a little bit of salt can enhance the drive to drink. Certainly it's argument, weigh yourself before and after. If you're down a couple pounds, drink some fluids, about 2 cups for every pound. Don't feel like you have to come out even. You certainly don't want to be above, but you may be a pound or 2 short. And some months of the year, you can't match the fluid loss. You are, it's a hot day, your buddy wants to ride at 4, that's just the way it's going to be. Now, the other thing is, though, losing greater than 2% of your body weight on a ride is associated with increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and increased perceived exertion. You're also probably going to be pretty glycogen depleted because you've lost a lot of that water in efforts to keep up with sweat loss. You're probably going to feel pretty crummy too. So it's a balance, but coming back, trying to drink enough fluid is an important part of that whole recovery process. Water's going into your glycogen stores. Water's refilling your cells. Drinking a little bit of salt with that or having some salt with your food in that process can help with the retention of that process rather than hitting John every 2 hours in the middle of the night. Okay, so summary, train with the diet. This isn't the night before activity or Wednesday before the big, we start making changes. The more you train with the diet, the better you recover, consume carbohydrates, the bigger your gas tank. Use food as a tool. Again, don't sacrifice your bike nutrition. We can pull calories out here and there around it, but not when you're on the bike. Yeah.
I just heard, I just processed what you said. You said you can get a bigger gas tank. Really?
Not by much.
Okay, that's what I'm.
You know, maybe 2,000 instead of 1,800.
Okay.
You know, it's not going to be 5,000.
Right, but okay. So you can influence that though.
Yes, with a high carbohydrate diet, with depletion and repletion. Yes. Yeah. Plan and prepare. That's that's the part I can't do for you. You got to shop. You have to buy this stuff, and then when you're out for 4 hours, where are you going to refuel? Where are you going to get your fluid? How are you going to pack all that stuff? That's all on you, and you got to figure that out so that you can optimize your training. You're out there for 4 hours and get the best of it. You want to practice eating and drinking. Again, the day of, you're not going to try your buddy's new flavor gel. You're doing the same thing. This is tried and true. You've done it before. You've had success. Try not to wait until you're thirsty. Cyclists can sometimes get caught up in the moment. You know, again, that accordion of the race, and next thing you know, you're an hour in and you haven't touched a water bottle. Those sorts of things we can be easily distracted, and so trying to stay on top of your fluid, maybe drawing lines, setting an alarm, one of your gadgets on your handlebars can remind you to drink some fluid rather than waiting long periods of time and trying to catch up. That's not the best way. But don't forget to recover appropriately. Recover, recover, recover. It's not, gorge, gorge, gorge. It's small every couple of hours. That's where a big part of some of our calories come in on. Why don't I lose weight? Well, let's look. You're doing enough said. Look at your, post-big ride. We tend to overdo it. Entitlement sets in. You didn't eat enough because you were trying to lose weight, and you get peer pressure. So.
Brava.